Welcome back to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ali, and today we are steeping ourselves in the world of Miss Marple. Now tell me, don't you just love how stories bring us together, no matter where we are in this big, beautiful world? Before we begin, I'd love to know, which corner of the world are you enjoying this story from? Let me know in the comments. I'm reading every single one. Let's get started. Chapter 1. Body Behind the Tent. The annual St. Mary Mead Village Festival was, as always, a triumph of local enthusiasm over practical organization. The morning sun cast dappled shadows through the ancient elms that bordered the green, and already the air hummed with activity. Bunting fluttered between lampposts, stalls displayed their wares with colorful abandon, and the persistent scent of Mrs. Partridge's famous jam tarts wafted from the refreshment tent. Miss Jane Marple, resplendent in her second-best hat, a modest creation of pale lavender felt with a single peacock feather, stood before the jam and preserves table. Her keen blue eyes assessed each entry with the gravity of a high court judge. She had been recruited for this particular task by the vicar, who had declared that no one in St. Mary Mead possesses a more discerning palate for preserves than our dear Miss Marple. "Such a lovely day for it," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley from the adjacent flower arrangement stand. "And to think, 300 years of village history celebrated right here on our green." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, though her attention had been momentarily diverted from the strawberry conserve she was examining. Across the lawn, she observed Councillor George Harding, the mayor, engaged in what appeared to be an animated conversation with a reporter from the County Gazette. The mayor's usually florid complexion seemed even more pronounced, and his gestures were expansive, perhaps too expansive for the hour and the occasion. Nervous tension, Miss Marple reflected silently. How very like my nephew Raymond, when he's preparing for a difficult case in court. Though what our mayor could be anxious about on such a festive day. Her musings were interrupted by a sharp exchange of words near the refreshment tent. Mrs. Diana Fletcher, a handsome woman in her early 40s who headed the festival organizing committee, was engaged in what could only be described as a heated whisper with Mr. Perkins, the festival treasurer. Though their voices were low, their body language spoke volumes. Mrs. Fletcher's hands clasped tightly before her, Mr. Perkins repeatedly glancing over his shoulder. "Trouble in paradise," muttered Colonel Bantry, who had materialized at Miss Marple's elbow with his characteristic stealth, a skill retained from his military days. "Has it indeed?" Miss Marple responded mildly, though she had already noted the treasurer's agitated manner and the way he clutched a leather cash-box as though it contained the crown jewels. The conversation between Mrs. Fletcher and Mr. Perkins concluded abruptly when the new vicar, a young man named Reverend Thornley, fresh from theological college, approached them. Both parties immediately assumed expressions of exaggerated pleasantness, though Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Fletcher's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The vicar himself seemed oddly distracted. His gaze was repeatedly drawn to the display case that housed the festival's grand prize, an ornate silver cup that had been donated by the Bantry family generations ago. He lingered near it with an intensity that struck Miss Marple as rather excessive for a man of the cloth, even one with an appreciation for ecclesiastical silver. "Admiring our family heirloom, is he?" Colonel Bantry observed, following Miss Marple's gaze. 17th century, you know. Been awarded to the best village craftsman every year since my grandfather's time." "How very generous of your family," Miss Marple replied, "though I must say the vicar seems unusually interested in its historical significance. Perhaps—" Before the colonel could respond, the village band struck up a cheerful, if slightly discordant rendition of the British Grenadiers, signaling the commencement of the Morris dancing exhibition. The crowd began to gravitate toward the main stage, a temporary platform erected at the far end of the green. It was precisely at this moment that Miss Marple noticed Mr. Perkins, making his way purposefully toward the back of the refreshment tent, still clutching the cash box. He paused briefly to speak with someone Miss Marple couldn't see, as her view was momentarily obscured by the Mothers Union banner being carried past, and then disappeared behind the white canvas structure. Odd, she murmured to herself. The Morris dancing is always such a popular event. One would think the treasurer would want to watch, especially as the collection is taken immediately afterward. The dancing commenced with its usual enthusiasm, bells jingling and handkerchiefs, waving as the performers executed their intricate steps. Miss Marple found herself a comfortable spot near the tea urn, where she could observe both the entertainment and the comings and goings around the various stalls. 20 minutes into the performance, just as the dancers were beginning their final set, a child's cry pierced the festive atmosphere. Young Tommy Jenkins came racing around the side of the refreshment tent, his face white with shock, his Sunday best shirt coming untucked as he ran. "There's a man," he gasped, skidding to a halt in front of the nearest adult who happened to be Police Constable Polk. Behind the tent, he's lying on the ground and he won't wake up. The music faltered and stopped. The Morris dancers froze mid-step, their bells falling silent in the sudden hush that descended over the festival ground. Miss Marple heard Colonel Bantry's gruff voice. "Better send for Inspector Slack and Dr. Haddock." Within minutes, the area behind the refreshment tent had been cordoned off with makeshift barriers of garden twine. Dr. Haddock emerged from behind the canvas, his expression grave. "It's Perkins," he announced quietly to the small group of officials that had gathered. "Dead, I'm afraid. Blunt force trauma to the back of the head." Miss Marple, positioned strategically near the tea urn where she could overhear without appearing to eavesdrop, noticed several things in quick succession. Mrs. Fletcher's hand flew to her throat in what seemed a genuinely shocked gesture. The mayor's florid complexion drained of all color, and the vicar crossed himself with a hand that trembled slightly. Inspector Slack arrived with his usual complement of barely contained irritation and official self-importance. "Right then," he declared, surveying the scene. "Nobody leaves the festival grounds until I say so. Constable Polk, start taking names." As the inspector disappeared behind the refreshment tent to examine the body, Miss Marple found herself recalling her brief glimpse of Mr. Perkins earlier that day. He had mentioned something about needing to reconcile the accounts. She was quite certain those had been his exact words. And now he was dead, apparently struck down during the very performance that had provided such perfect cover for the crime, with most of the village conveniently gathered at the opposite end of the green. "The cash box," she said softly to herself. And then, raising her voice slightly, "I do hope someone has thought to secure the festival's cash box. Mr. Perkins was carrying it when I last saw him." This observation, delivered in Miss Marple's mild, quavering tone, had the effect of a starting pistol. Inspector Slack emerged from behind the tent looking thunderous. "The cash box is missing," he announced, along with the day's takings. "Over $200, according to the preliminary count this morning." He fixed the assembled crowd with a stern glare. "It appears we're dealing not just with murder, but with theft as well." The murmur that ran through the crowd held notes of shock, fear, and Miss Marple couldn't help but notice something that sounded very much like guilty knowledge. As she watched the faces around her, she reflected that village festivals, like village life itself, had a way of bringing out both the best and worst in human nature. The question now was, which of her neighbors had allowed the worst to triumph so catastrophically on this sunny summer morning? The morning room at Mrs. Perkins' modest cottage on Vicarage Lane was steeped in that particular quality of silence that follows sudden bereavement. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with unnecessary loudness, and the tea in the delicate china cups had long since grown cold. Miss Marple sat opposite the newly widowed woman, noting how Mrs. Perkins's hands trembled slightly as she attempted to straighten an already perfectly aligned antimacassar. So kind of you to call, Miss Marple, Mrs. Perkins murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She was a small, neat woman with prematurely gray hair and the permanently anxious expression of someone who had spent years managing a difficult household budget. Though I suppose everyone will be calling now. Terrible scandal. Terrible. My dear, Miss Marple said gently, you mustn't think of it as scandal. This dreadful thing that has happened reflects not at all upon you or dear Mr. Perkins. Mrs. Perkins's eyes filled with tears. He was so worried these past weeks. Kept talking about irregularities. That was the word he used. Irregularities in the festival accounts. He'd sit up late at night going over the books, muttering to himself. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. I told him he was working too hard, that the festival wasn't worth losing sleep over. But he said it was his duty. His duty to the village. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Did he mention what sort of irregularities? Oh, he didn't like to burden me with financial matters. But I heard him on the telephone once. Quite agitated. He was saying something about systematic withdrawals and forged signatures. I didn't like to pry, you understand. Before Miss Marple could pursue this interesting revelation, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Perkins started nervously. That will be another caller. Everyone's been so kind. But I do find it exhausting. The maid showed an Inspector Slack, whose official demeanor softened marginally at the sight of the grieving widow. Sorry to disturb you, Mrs. Perkins. Just a few more questions, if you don't mind, of course. Inspector, Miss Marple was just leaving. No need for Miss Marple to go, Slack interrupted, surprising everyone, including himself. Her observations might be useful. This unprecedented acknowledgement of her detecting abilities caused Miss Marple to raise her eyebrows ever so slightly. But she merely folded her hands in her lap and assumed an expression of elderly vagueness that fooled absolutely no one who knew her well. Mrs. Perkins, the inspector began, consulting his notebook, we've been examining the festival accounts, and there appear to be significant discrepancies, nearly $500 missing over the past year. Mrs. Perkins gasped. 500? But that's impossible. Harold would never— No one's suggesting Mr. Perkins took the money, Slack said quickly. In fact, we believe he may have discovered the theft and been killed to prevent him from revealing it. Now, can you tell me if your husband mentioned anyone in particular when discussing these irregularities? Mrs. Perkins hesitated, twisting her handkerchief. Well, he did seem concerned about— But no, I shouldn't say. It's only suspicion after all. In a murder investigation, madam, we need to hear everything. It was Mrs. Fletcher, Mrs. Perkins finally admitted. Harold said her signature appeared on several withdrawal slips, but when he asked her about them, she seemed confused. He thought perhaps— he wondered if someone might be forging her signature. After the inspector departed, having extracted a few more details about Mr. Perkins's concerns, Miss Marple made her own farewells and walked thoughtfully through the village. The aftermath of yesterday's tragedy was evident everywhere. Small groups of villagers clustered in doorways, speaking in low voices. Shops that would normally be bustling stood half empty, and an unusual number of curtains twitched as she passed. She had just turned into the high street when she encountered Colonel Bantry emerging from the post office. Ah, Miss Marple. Dreadful business. What the whole village is buzzing with. Indeed. And I fear it's about to become even more sensational. She nodded toward the village hall, where a small crowd was gathering. Unless I'm very much mistaken, Counselor Harding is about to make some sort of announcement. They arrived just as the mayor stepped onto the makeshift platform that had been erected outside the hall. His face was grave, his manner portentous. Citizens of St. Mary Mead, he began. In light of yesterday's tragic events and following consultation with the police, I feel it my duty to address certain rumors that have been circulating. A hush fell over the crowd. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Fletcher standing near the back, her face pale but composed. "It pains me to say this," Harding continued, "but evidence has come to light suggesting that festival funds have been systematically misappropriated over the past year. While I name no names at this stage, I must inform you that certain members of the festival committee are under investigation." The murmur that ran through the crowd was like wind through autumn leaves. Miss Marple saw several heads turn toward Mrs. Fletcher, who stood very still, her chin lifted slightly. "Furthermore," Harding went on, his voice rising, "I have reason to believe that poor Mr. Perkins was murdered because he discovered this embezzlement. The person responsible for these thefts had both motive and opportunity to silence him permanently." "Outrageous!" The voice rang out clear and sharp. Mrs. Fletcher stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "How dare you stand there and imply, without any proof, that a member of the committee is both a thief and a murderer?" "My dear Diana," Harding replied, and there was something in his use of her first name that made Miss Marple's eyes narrow, "I merely state facts. The investigation will determine the guilty party." "Facts?" Mrs. Fletcher's voice trembled with controlled fury. "The fact is that you've disliked me ever since I—" She broke off abruptly, color flooding her cheeks. The tension between them was palpable. Miss Marple, watching carefully, saw something flicker in Harding's eyes. Triumph, satisfaction, or perhaps something more personal. Later that afternoon, over tea in her own cottage, Miss Marple confided in her friend Mrs. Bantry. "Most illuminating, that little scene. Did you notice how personally Counselor Harding seemed to take the whole matter?" "Rather hard to miss," Mrs. Bantry replied, helping herself to another scone. "Everyone knows they were engaged once, years ago, before she married Fletcher and moved away. She only returned to the village after her husband died last year." "Ah." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked thoughtfully. "And how did the engagement end?" "Rather suddenly, as I remember. One week they were planning a spring wedding. The next she'd broken it off and married Fletcher within the month. Harding was devastated, went about looking like thunder for ages. And now he has the opportunity to cast suspicion upon her in a very public manner," Miss Marple mused, though whether from genuine belief in her guilt or from some lingering resentment. "You don't think she did it, then?" Miss Marple paused in her knitting. "I think, my dear, that in villages like ours, the past has a way of casting very long shadows, and sometimes those shadows obscure the truth quite effectively." That evening, as she prepared for bed, Miss Marple reviewed the day's events in her mind, the accounts with their mysterious discrepancies, Mrs. Perkins' revelation about forged signatures, the very public accusation against Mrs. Fletcher, and underneath it all, the curious undercurrent of old romance turned sour. Through her bedroom window, she could see lights still burning in several cottages. The village was wakeful tonight, disturbed not just by murder, but by the revelation of financial impropriety and the resurrection of old grievances. As she drew the curtains, Miss Marple reflected that money and love, especially love gone wrong, were perhaps the two most powerful motives for murder in the entire criminal calendar. The question was, which one had led to Mr. Perkins lying dead behind the refreshment tent? Or had it perhaps been a fatal combination of both? Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a call on Mrs. Fletcher. There were questions that needed asking, and sometimes a sympathetic ear could elicit more truth than any amount of official questioning. Besides, she had noticed something during that confrontation outside the village hall, something about the way Mrs. Fletcher had broken off her sentence and the look that had passed between her and the mayor. Yes, tomorrow would be most instructive. Miss Marple settled into bed, her mind already forming the gentle questions that might unlock the secrets hidden behind St. Mary Mead's respectable facades. The Morning Post brought an unexpected development to the investigation. Inspector Slack, arriving at the police station with his characteristic blend of efficiency and irritability, found a manila envelope on his desk marked Urgent Festival. Accounts Audit. Inside was a detailed financial report that made his eyebrows rise progressively higher with each page. 523, he muttered to Constable Polk, who had just brought in the morning tea. Systematically siphoned off over the past 14 months. And look at this. Each withdrawal required 2 signatures. One was always Perkins, poor devil, and the other... He ran his finger down the column of names. Mrs. Fletcher's signature appears on over 60% of them. Looks bad for her, sir, Polk observed, peering over his superior's shoulder. Perhaps too bad, Slack mused. Almost as if someone wanted us to notice her signature particularly. He shuffled through the papers again. Still, we'll need to question her about these transactions. Though what bothers me is why Perkins signed them if he suspected fraud. Unless... Unless he only recently noticed the pattern, sir? Exactly, Polk. Or unless the signatures themselves are forgeries. Meanwhile, at the vicarage, Miss Marple was taking tea with Reverend Thornley. The young vicar seemed distracted, his eyes constantly darting to the window that overlooked the churchyard. More tea, Miss Marple? He offered, though her cup was still half full. Thank you, no. I actually called to ask about the arrangements for poor Mr. Perkins's funeral. Such a dedicated member of the church finance committee. Yes, indeed, the vicar replied, hastily. Though, of course, his work with the festival committee was entirely separate from church affairs. Different accounts altogether. Completely different. Miss Marple's keen eyes noticed how the vicar's hands trembled slightly as he replaced his teacup in its saucer. I suppose you'll be storing the festival silver cup here in the church until next year's event? The vicar started visibly. The cup? Oh yes, the bantry cup. It's already in the vestry safe, actually. Has been since yesterday morning, perfectly secure. How reassuring. Though I suppose after recent events one can't be too careful with valuable items. After taking her leave, Miss Marple decided to revisit the festival grounds. The area had been largely cleared, but a few volunteers were still dismantling stalls and collecting forgotten items. She made her way to the spot where the refreshment tent had stood, now marked only by flattened grass and a few tent peg holes. Looking for clues, Miss Marple? She turned to find young Tommy Jenkins, the boy who had discovered the body, watching her with bright, intelligent eyes. Just taking a walk, Tommy. Though I must say, you showed remarkable presence of mind yesterday. Most boys your age would have been too frightened to speak so clearly to the police. Tommy puffed up with pride. I watch detective shows on the telly. Know you're supposed to remember everything when you find a body. Very wise. And did you remember everything? Think so. Except... He scrunched up his face in concentration. There was something shiny in the bushes near where Mr. Perkins was lying. Didn't mention it to the police, 'cause when they arrived it wasn't there anymore. How very interesting. Can you show me exactly where? Tommy led her to a spot behind where the refreshment tent had stood, indicating a patch of bushes that bordered the churchyard. Right there. Something metal was catching the sun. Miss Marple peered into the undergrowth. Then, with surprising agility for a woman of her years, bent down and parted the branches. I don't suppose it looked anything like this. She withdrew her hand holding a brass key. No, it was bigger. More like a box or something. A box, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. She examined the key, noting its size and cut. Church property was stamped on the shaft. She slipped it into her handbag. Well, Tommy, you've been most helpful. I believe I'll take a turn through the churchyard now. The ancient yew trees in St. Mary Mead's churchyard cast deep shadows across weathered headstones. Miss Marple followed the path that curved behind the church, her sharp eyes scanning the ground. Near a particularly dense holly bush, she noticed freshly disturbed earth. Kneeling carefully, she probed the soft soil with her finger. Something hard lay just beneath the surface. Using a sturdy twig, she excavated her find, an empty cash box, its lock forced open. The festival committee's name was still visible on a brass plate affixed to the lid. "The murder weapon arrives at the scene clean," she murmured to herself, "but the stolen goods tell their own story." "Miss Marple?" She looked up, to see Mrs. Fletcher approaching along the path, her son Robert trailing behind with a sullen expression that seemed permanently affixed to 16-year-old faces. "Mrs. Fletcher." "Robert, what brings you to the churchyard?" "Robert's been helping with the festival cleanup," Mrs. Fletcher explained. Her voice was steady, but dark circles under her eyes suggested a sleepless night. "We're collecting any stray items that might have ended up over here." "How thoughtful." Miss Marple stood casually, positioning herself to block the view of the cash box. "Though I've just finished checking this area myself. Nothing of interest here." Robert, who had been examining his mobile phone, suddenly looked up. "Mom, can I go? I told Jake I'd meet him at the recreation ground." "Yes, all right, but be home for lunch." As the boy loped off, Mrs. Fletcher sighed. "Teenagers? Though I suppose I should be grateful he's willing to help at all. He was quite devoted to the festival this year, even volunteered for the tombola stall, which surprised me. Indeed, most unexpected for a boy his age." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, though he seemed particularly interested in the photography exhibit. "Kept asking when the newspaper would publish all the pictures from the festival." She paused, then added with forced casualness, "I don't suppose you've heard when they might appear?" "I believe the editor mentioned this week's edition. They took quite a comprehensive collection, I understand." Mrs. Fletcher's smile didn't reach her eyes. "How nice. Well, I should continue with the cleanup." After she left, Miss Marple carefully photographed the cash box with the small camera she always carried in her handbag, a gift from her nephew Raymond, who had declared that even elderly aunts should embrace modern technology. She then made her way to the newspaper office. Mr. Lawrence Redding, the festival photographer, was hunched over a computer screen, sorting through hundreds of images. "Miss Marple, just the person I wanted to see. You've got such an eye for detail. Would you mind looking at these photos? I need to select the best ones for this week's spread." "I'd be delighted, Mr. Reading." As they scrolled through the images, Miss Marple paid particular attention to those taken in the hour before the murder. One showed Mr. Perkins walking purposefully toward the refreshment tent, cash box under his arm, his face set in determined lines. Another captured the Morris dancers in full swing, with most of the village gathered to watch. But in the background, barely visible, was a figure heading in the opposite direction. "Could you enlarge that section?" Miss Marple asked, pointing. Reading zoomed in. The figure became clearer, someone in a festival committee sash walking quickly toward the refreshment area. The timestamp showed 11:42 a.m., just minutes before Tommy Jenkins's discovery. "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Mr. Reading, do you have any other photos from around that time?" "Let me check." He pulled up another folder. "Here's one from 11:38, showing the main stage area, and another from 11:45, just after the Morris dancing ended." The 11:45 photo showed people beginning to disperse from the main stage. In the far background, a figure could be seen emerging from behind the refreshment tent, not running but walking with deliberate haste toward the church. "I don't suppose you could print copies of these for me?" Miss Marple asked sweetly. "For the church newsletter, you understand. We like to document all the village events." That evening, back in her cottage, Miss Marple spread the photographs across her dining table alongside her notes. The cash box? Hidden, but not well enough. The figure in the photographs, identity obscured, but movement suspicious. The missing festival money, $500 taken over 14 months. And at the center of it all, Mrs. Fletcher's signatures on 60% of the withdrawal. Slips. She picked up the church key she'd found in the bushes, turning it over in her fingers. Something about its presence bothered her. Why would a church key be lying in the bushes near a murder scene? Unless... The telephone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Colonel Bantry, his voice unusually agitated. "Miss Marple, you'll never believe what's happened. I went to check on the Bantry cup in the vestry. Thought I'd give it a polish before they put it away properly, and it's gone. There's a cup there, all right, but it's not ours. Someone's replaced our family heirloom with a clever fake." Miss Marple sat very still. The church key was warm in her palm. 3 crimes, she realized. Embezzlement, murder, and now theft of a priceless heirloom. Were they connected by a single thread of guilt? Or were multiple sins converging on St. Mary Mead's most festive day? "I'll be right over, Colonel," she said quietly. "I believe it's time we had a very thorough look at your family cup, or rather, at what someone hopes we'll believe is your family cup." As she prepared to leave, one thought crystallized in her mind. In her experience, when valuable items went missing during moments of chaos, it usually meant someone had been planning the theft well in advance. The question was, had Mr. Perkins been murdered because he discovered the embezzlement, or because he stumbled upon another crime entirely? The shadows were lengthening across St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple stepped out into the evening air. Somewhere in the village, at least one person, possibly more, was harboring secrets worth killing for. And with each passing hour, those secrets were becoming harder to contain. Chapter 4. The Photographer's Evidence. Colonel Bantry's study had been transformed into an impromptu crime investigation center. The fake silver cup sat on his desk, gleaming dully under the lamplight, while the genuine article's absence seemed to fill the room with palpable tension. Inspector Slack, summoned hastily from the police station, examined the replica with a jeweler's loupe borrowed from Mr. Empt's shop on the high street. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he admitted grudgingly. "This wasn't knocked together overnight. Someone planned this substitution carefully." Miss Marple, seated quietly in a leather armchair, studied the fake cup with interest. "May I?" She extended her hand, and Slack, after a moment's hesitation, passed it to her. "Notice how the patina has been artificially aged," she observed, turning the cup to catch the light. "Very like the technique my nephew Raymond described in that case of art fraud he handled last year. And see here," she indicated a tiny mark near the base. "The hallmark is slightly off-center. The original is perfectly aligned." "You've quite an eye for detail, Miss Marple," Colonel Bantry remarked. "I must confess I didn't notice the switch immediately myself." "When did you last see the genuine cup?" Slack asked, notebook at the ready. "The morning of the festival. I brought it from the house to the church myself. Handed it directly to Reverend Thornley for safekeeping in the vestry." "And no one else had access?" "Well, the vestry isn't exactly Fort Knox," the colonel admitted. "Various people have keys: the vicar, the church wardens, the cleaning ladies." A knock at the study door interrupted them. The butler announced Mr. Lawrence Reading, who entered carrying a large portfolio case. "I've brought all the festival photographs as requested," Reading said, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the official presence, "including the ones Miss Marple was particularly interested in earlier today." "Ah, excellent," Slack said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely pleased about Miss Marple's independent inquiries. "Let's have a look." Reading spread the photographs across the colonel's billiard table. The comprehensive documentation of the festival day emerged in vivid detail, from the early morning setup to the tragic aftermath of the murder discovery. This sequence is particularly interesting, Miss Marple suggested mildly, arranging several photos in chronological order. Look here. At 9:15 a.m., we see Reverend Thornley entering the vestry with the colonel. At 9:20, they emerge empty-handed, presumably having secured the cup. But then, she selected another photograph. At 10:47, this image taken from the flower show tent captures a reflection in the memorial plaque by the church door. Someone is entering the vestry. See the distinctive sleeve? That's the vicar's cassock. But I was leading the opening prayers at the main stage at that time, Thornley protested, having been summoned to explain the cup's disappearance. His face had gone quite pale. Were you indeed? Miss Marple produced another photo. This shows the opening ceremony. You're notably absent from the platform. The curate is leading the prayers. Thornley's shoulders sagged. All right, yes, I went back to the vestry, but not to steal the cup. I wanted to verify something about its markings. I've been researching ecclesiastical silver for a book I'm writing. Rather an inopportune moment for academic research, Slack observed dryly. Here's something else. Reading interjected, pulling out a new set of prints. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I captured this image at 11:15. The photograph showed the area behind the refreshment tent from an oblique angle. In the background, barely visible, were two figures in what appeared to be an intense conversation. Can you enlarge this section? Miss Marple asked. Reading produced a magnified version. Though still somewhat blurry, the figures were identifiable. Mr. Perkins and Counselor Harding. But Harding claimed he was judging the flower show at that time, Slack exclaimed. More interesting still, Miss Marple continued, selecting another photograph. Is this image from 1140? Mr. Perkins walking toward the refreshment tent, looking determined. And here, she pointed to the edge of the frame, someone following him. The committee sash is visible, but the person's face is turned away. The killer, Colonel Bantry suggested. Perhaps, or perhaps a witness. Miss Marple arranged the final sequence of photographs. Now observe. 11:42. The Morris dancers are in full swing. 11:43. This wide shot shows most of the village watching. But look carefully at the churchyard wall in the background. They all leaned in. A figure could be seen climbing over the low wall, moving from the festival ground into the churchyard. Robert Fletcher. Miss Marple identified quietly. I recognize that distinctive jacket he always wears. The Fletcher boy? Slack protested. But he's just a teenager. A teenager who was supposedly manning the tombola stall continuously, Miss Marple reminded him. Yet here he is, clearly elsewhere at a crucial time. The room fell silent as they absorbed this information. Reading cleared his throat nervously. There's one more thing. I didn't develop these initially because they seemed irrelevant, but... He produced a final set of prints. These were taken by my assistant, who was photographing the youth activities. They show Robert Fletcher at various points during the day. The images revealed an interesting pattern. In several photos, Robert could be seen handling money at the tombola stall, but his attention was consistently directed elsewhere, toward the refreshment tent and the church. And look at this one. Redding pointed to a shot time-stamped at 10:30 a.m. Robert was captured in conversation with Mr. Perkins, both of them partially hidden behind the plant stall. My assistant noted that they seemed to be arguing about something. Inspector Slack's expression had grown increasingly grim. We'll need to question the boy immediately, and search the vestry thoroughly for any sign of how the cup was switched. If I might make a suggestion, Miss Marple interjected. The key I found in the bushes this afternoon, the one marked church property, it might be worth checking if it fits the vestry door. Slack looked at her sharply. You found a key and didn't immediately report it? I was on my way to do just that when the colonel called about the cup, she replied serenely. Though I did think it prudent to photograph its location first. She produced her small camera, showing the image of the key in situ among the bushes. The inspector took the key from her, examining it closely. "We'll test this immediately, and I want all these photographs catalogued as evidence." He turned to the vicar. "Reverend Thornley, I'll need a complete statement about your movements during the festival, particularly your unauthorized visit to the vestry." As the officials prepared to leave, Miss Marple lingered by the billiard table, studying one photograph in particular. It showed the refreshment tent from the rear, taken just minutes before the murder. In the background, almost lost in shadow, was the cash box. But it wasn't under Mr. Perkins's arm, as in earlier photos. It sat on a small table, unattended. "Curious," she murmured to herself. "Very curious indeed." Later that evening, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple spread her own copies of the key photographs across her tea table. She had requested duplicates from Redding, who had been only too happy to oblige, clearly excited by his unexpected role in a murder investigation. The narrative emerging from the images was complex, multiple people with secrets, all converging at the festival. The vicar, obsessed with the valuable cup. Robert Fletcher, mysteriously absent from his post at crucial moments. Counselor Harding, lying about his whereabouts. And Mrs. Fletcher, whose signatures appeared on those suspicious withdrawal slips. But it was another detail that caught her attention as she reviewed the photos one final time. In the background of the 11:15 image, the one showing Perkins and Harding in conversation, there was a third figure partially obscured by the tent flap. Someone watching them. Miss Marple adjusted her reading glasses and peered more closely. The figure wore a festival helper's badge, and something about their posture suggested intense interest in the conversation taking place. Now why? Miss Marple wondered aloud. Would a festival helper be eavesdropping on the treasurer and the mayor, unless they had a very particular interest in what was being discussed? She made a mental note to ask young Tommy Jenkins if he had noticed any of the festival helpers behaving oddly. Children, in her experience, often saw things adults missed, especially when those adults were preoccupied with their own secrets and schemes. Outside, the village had settled into its evening quiet. But Miss Marple knew that beneath this peaceful surface, tensions were building. The photographer's evidence had revealed a web of deception more complex than even she had initially suspected. 3 crimes: embezzlement, murder, and the theft of a historic artifact, each with its own cast of suspects. The question now was not just who had killed Mr. Perkins, but whether his death was the culmination of one elaborate plot, or the tragic intersection of multiple schemes gone wrong. As she prepared for bed, one thought dominated. Tomorrow she would need to examine that vestry very carefully indeed. For in her experience, the scene of one crime often held clues to others. And the vestry of St. Mary Mead Church had witnessed at least one theft. What other? She had a particular route in mind today, one that would retrace the treasurer's final journey, starting from the main festival ground. She walked slowly, observing the sightlines. The Morris dancers had performed here, creating both spectacle and distraction. Most villagers would have been focused on the stage, backs to the area behind the refreshment tent, where Mr. Perkins met his end. Ah, Miss Marple. Early morning. Constitutional? She turned to find Mrs. Price Ridley approaching with her pair of overexcitable poodles. Indeed. I find the morning air so beneficial for clarity of thought. Dreadful business about Perkins. I hear the police suspect that Fletcher woman. Always thought there was something not quite right about her, returning to the village after all, these years. Did you happen to notice anything unusual during the festival, Mrs. Price Ridley? You have such an excellent view of the green from your cottage. The woman puffed up slightly at this acknowledgement of her advantageous position. Well, now that you mention it, I did see young Robert Fletcher running through the churchyard. Most peculiar, considering he was supposed to be at the tombola stall. And he seemed to be carrying something. How interesting. What time was this? Oh, just after the Morris dancing started. I remember because those bells gave my poor darling such a fright. She gestured to her dogs. He was running as if the devil himself were after him. After Mrs. Price Ridley continued on her way, Miss Marple proceeded along the path Mr. Perkins would have taken. She paused at the spot where the photographer had captured Perkins and Harding in conversation, imagining the scene. "Good morning, Miss Marple." She looked up to find the postmistress, Mrs. Sweetman, sorting the morning delivery outside the post office. "Good morning, Mrs. Sweetman. I don't suppose you noticed anything unusual during the festival? Your post office has such a good view of the church entrance." "Funny you should ask. I've been thinking about it since the murder. I saw that new vicar going into the church at the oddest times, back and forth like he couldn't make up his mind about something. And the last time, just before that poor Mr. Perkins was found, he came out looking white as a sheet." "Did he indeed? How observant of you." "Well, you know how it is. Standing here sorting mail, you see all sorts. Like that argument between the mayor and Mrs. Fletcher earlier that morning. Couldn't hear what they were saying, but she looked ready to spit fire." Miss Marple filed this information away and continued her walk. As she approached the church, she encountered Colonel Bantry's gardener, Jim Bennett, tending to the flower beds. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Nasty business, all this." "Indeed, Jim. I wonder if you noticed anything unusual near the churchyard recently." Jim straightened up, wiping his hands on his gardening apron. "Well, there was something odd yesterday evening. After all, the police had left. I was tidying up some of the festival damage to the flower beds when I saw someone putting something in the old oak tree. You know, the hollow one at the edge of the churchyard." "How curious. Did you see who it was?" "Two. Dark by then, I'm afraid, but they were being mighty careful about not being seen, kept looking over their shoulder." Miss Marple thanked him and made her way to the ancient oak. The hollow was just above head height. Standing on tiptoe, she peered inside and felt around, with her gloved hand. Her fingers encountered something soft, velvet by the texture. She withdrew a small jewelry box, the kind that might hold a precious heirloom. Opening it carefully, she found it empty, save for the indentation where something circular had recently rested. The size and shape would perfectly accommodate the base of the Bantry cup. "Curiouser and curiouser," she murmured, photographing the box before replacing it exactly as found. Her next stop was the village shop, where she knew the morning gossip exchange would be in full swing. Sure enough, several ladies were gathered around the counter, where Mrs. Abbey, the shopkeeper, held court. "I always said those festival accounts needed proper auditing," Mrs. Abbey was declaring. "My nephew works in a bank, you know, and he says 2 signatures mean nothing if both people are in on the fraud." "But poor Mr. Perkins would never," began Miss Weatherby, the retired schoolmistress. "Oh, I'm not saying Perkins was involved in the stealing," Mrs. Abbey interrupted. "But he might have been too trusting, signing whatever was put in front of him without checking properly." Miss Marple selected a tin of biscuits and approached the counter. "I suppose managing festival finances is more complicated than one might think?" "You can say that again," Mrs. Abbey agreed. "Mrs. Fletcher came in here last month, quite flustered, asking if I kept copies of old receipts. Said there were some discrepancies in the books and she needed to verify some expenses. Looked worried sick, she did." After leaving the shop, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. The Reverend Thornley was in his study, surrounded by books on ecclesiastical silver. "Miss Marple, I suppose you've come about yesterday's revelations." He gestured helplessly at his research materials. "I know how it must look, my lying about being in the vestry, but I swear I had nothing to do with the theft of the cup." "Perhaps you could tell me exactly what you were researching, Vicar?" "Ha!" Picked up a scholarly journal, opened to a marked page. "The Bantry cup, you see, appears to be far more valuable than anyone realized. According to this article, it bears the hallmarks of Thomas Gilpin, a renowned 17th-century silversmith whose works are extremely rare. A similar piece sold at Sotheby's last year for a considerable sum. I see. And when did you make this discovery? About a month ago. I've been trying to verify it ever since. That's why I kept going back to examine the cup. I was planning to tell Colonel Bantry after the festival, suggest having it properly authenticated and insured. And who else knew about your research? No one. I thought I'd been very discreet. Although... He paused, looking troubled. I did leave this journal open on my desk once when Robert Fletcher came to help with the church newsletter. He's quite interested in history, often asks questions about the church artifacts. After leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple sat on a bench in the churchyard, organizing her thoughts. The morning's conversations had revealed a web of activities around the time of the murder. Robert Fletcher running through the churchyard, the vicar making suspicious visits to the vestry, Harding arguing with Mrs. Fletcher, and someone hiding a velvet box in the oak tree. As she pondered these disparate elements, she noticed something glinting in the grass near the bench. Bending down, she discovered a small silver charm, a tiny sailing ship. She recognized it immediately as belonging to Mrs. Fletcher's charm bracelet, which she had admired at the Women's Institute meeting last week. Now why? Miss Marple wondered. Aloud. Would Diana Fletcher's charm be lying in the churchyard when she claimed to have been nowhere near here during the festival? Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, looking more harassed than usual. Miss Marple, I've just had the forensics report on that key you found. It does indeed fit the vestry door, and it has partial fingerprints, too smudged for identification, unfortunately. But here's the interesting part. It's not one of the official church keys. It's a copy, recently made. How very interesting. Inspector, that suggests premeditation, doesn't it? Exactly. Someone planned to access that vestry. We're checking with all the locksmiths in the county to see who might have made it. He paused, then added grudgingly, I don't suppose your morning walk has turned up anything useful? Miss Marple smiled gently. Oh, just the usual village observations, Inspector. Though I did learn that Mrs. Fletcher was concerned about discrepancies in the festival accounts as far back as last month, before Mr. Perkins mentioned anything to his wife. And young Robert seems to have known about the true value of the Bantry cup, thanks to the vicar's research. Slack's eyes narrowed. You think the boy stole the cup? I think, Inspector, that we have 3 separate crimes that happen to converge at the festival. The embezzlement of funds had been going on for months. The plan to steal the cup was more recent, but carefully prepared. And the murder... She paused thoughtfully. The murder, I believe, was the unplanned consequence of these other schemes colliding. 3 crimes. 3 criminals? Not necessarily, but certainly 3 different motivations. The question is, which combination of our suspects was responsible for which crime? As Inspector Slack hurried off to pursue these new leads, Miss Marple remained on her bench, turning the silver charm over in her fingers. 3 crimes, multiple suspects, and a web of lies and secrets. But somewhere in this tangle was a thread of truth, and she was beginning to see how to unravel it. The church clock struck noon, its chimes echoing across the village. Time, Miss Marple reflected, to stop gathering clues and start connecting them. 3 separate schemes, all reaching their climax during one village festival. And poor Mr. Perkins, the unwitting catalyst, whose discovery of one crime had led to his death. But which crime had he discovered? And more importantly, who had felt threatened enough to silence him forever? Chapter 6. The Shocking Truth. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Miss Marple's cottage, illuminating the faces of those gathered in her sitting room. Inspector. Slack occupied the largest armchair, his notebook at the ready. Colonel Bantry stood by the fireplace. Mrs. Fletcher sat rigidly on the sofa beside her son Robert, whose sullen expression had given way to barely concealed anxiety. Counselor Harding had positioned himself near the door, as if contemplating escape, and the Reverend Thornley perched nervously on a straight-backed chair. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her knitting needles clicking softly. "I thought it might be helpful to clarify the rather complex events of the festival. Day. 3 crimes occurred, you see, though they were not necessarily committed by 3 different people." "Get on with it, then," Slack muttered, though not unkindly. "Let us begin with the embezzlement," Miss Marple continued. 523 withdrawn over 14 months. The withdrawals required 2 signatures, Mr. Perkins and one other. Mrs. Fletcher's signature appeared most frequently. Diana Fletcher's face flushed. "I've already explained—" "Indeed you have, my dear. And you spoke the truth. Your signatures were forged." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Counselor Harding. "Weren't they, George?" The mayor's florid complexion deepened. "I don't know what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting that you systematically stole from the festival funds to cover your gambling debts. The debts you incurred at the casino in Brighton. The one where Mrs. Price Ridley's nephew works as a croupier. He mentioned seeing you there frequently, losing substantial sums." Harding's shoulders sagged. "All right, yes, but I never meant— I always intended to pay it back. The horses were due to come in eventually." "But Mr. Perkins discovered the discrepancies," Miss Marple continued. "He confronted you during the festival, behind the refreshment tent. The photographer captured your meeting. You argued. And Perkins threatened to expose you unless the money was repaid immediately." "I didn't kill him," Harding burst out. "I left him alive, I swear. He gave me until Monday to come up with the money." "I believe you," Miss Marple said calmly. "You're guilty of theft, not murder. Though your attempt to deflect suspicion onto Mrs. Fletcher, your former fiancée, who had the temerity to reject you, was particularly cruel." She turned to the vicar. "Now, the second crime, the theft of the Bantry cup. Reverend Thornley, you discovered its true value a month ago." The vicar nodded miserably. "The Thomas Gilpin hallmark. The cup is worth at least $50,000, possibly more. I couldn't bear to see it sitting in our vestry with inadequate security, while the church roof leaked and the organ wheezed its last breath." "So you had a replica made," Miss Marple said. "Using that specialized silversmith in London, the one whose card I found in your study wastebasket. You had a key copied to access the vestry whenever needed. Your plan was to switch the cups during the festival's confusion, sell the original, and donate the proceeds anonymously to the Church Restoration Fund." "I know it was wrong," Thornley whispered, "but I convinced myself it was for a higher purpose, the needs of the parish." "A curious interpretation of the 8th commandment," Colonel Bantry observed dryly. "You successfully made the switch," Miss Marple continued. "The empty velvet box hidden in the oak tree was meant to transport the real cups safely after the festival. But you didn't commit murder either, did you?" "Never. I couldn't." Miss Marple's gaze now settled on Robert Fletcher, who had gone very pale. Which brings us to the murder itself. "Robert, you had been stealing from the festival cash box throughout the day, small amounts you thought wouldn't be noticed. The tombola stall provided perfect cover. All that loose change, easy to pocket a few pounds here and there," Diana Fletcher gasped. "Robert, you didn't—" "Let me continue," Miss Marple said gently. "You knew about the cup's value because you'd seen the vicar's research. You also knew your mother was worried about the festival accounts. You thought, if money went missing during the festival, It would be blamed on whoever was embezzling the funds. A perfect cover for your own petty thefts. Robert's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. But then Mr. Perkins caught you, Miss Marple continued inexorably. Not at the tombola stall, but behind the refreshment tent. You'd slipped away during the Morris dancing, thinking everyone was distracted. You were removing money from the cash box, which Perkins had left momentarily unattended after his confrontation with the mayor. I didn't mean to, Robert whispered, tears starting to roll down his cheeks. He grabbed my arm, said, he was calling the police. I panicked. There was a croquet mallet lying there. Someone had left it after the games. I swung without thinking. Diana Fletcher let out a strangled sob, reaching for her son's hand. You took the entire cash box to make it look like robbery, Miss Marple said. Buried it hastily in the churchyard, then ran back to your stall. But in your panic, you dropped something, a key. You'd been carrying not the vestry key that belonged to the vicar, but a different key altogether. She produced the church key from her handbag. This is actually the key to the church tower. You'd stolen it weeks ago, planning to hide your pilfered money there. You'd been taking small amounts from various church collections, hadn't you? That's why you volunteered to help with the newsletter, access to the church when it was empty. Robert. Diana Fletcher's voice was barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Mom, Robert sobbed. I never meant. I just wanted. Dad always said we didn't have enough money. I thought I was helping. Inspector Slack rose, his face grave. Robert Fletcher, I'm arresting you for the murder of Harold Perkins. You do not have to say anything. Wait, Diana Fletcher interrupted, her face drawn but determined. My son is 16. He needs proper representation. This was clearly not premeditated murder, Slack said, not unkindly, but his age will certainly be taken into consideration. As Robert was led away, his mother following with a lawyer's card already in hand, the others sat in stunned silence. 3 crimes, Colonel Bantry finally said. 3 criminals, all colliding at our village festival. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Councillor Harding's embezzlement discovered by poor Mr. Perkins, the vicar's misguided attempt to help his church through theft, and a teenager's petty pilfering that escalated to tragedy when discovery threatened. But how did you know? Reverend Thornley asked. How did you piece it all together? Miss Marple set down her knitting. Human nature, Vicar. Greed, desperation, and panic, they create patterns as distinctive as any fingerprint. The mayor's animosity toward Mrs. Fletcher spoke of old resentment, not genuine suspicion. Your nervous obsession with the cup suggested guilty knowledge. And Robert, well, teenagers who suddenly volunteer for tedious tasks usually have ulterior motives. What happens now? The vicar asked quietly. Justice, I suppose, Slack replied. Councillor Harding will face embezzlement charges. You, Reverend, will answer for the attempted theft, though I suspect the church authorities will deal with you more severely than the civil courts. And young Robert, well, given his age and the circumstances, one hopes for rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. As the room emptied, Miss Marple walked to her window, looking out over the village green where the festival had so recently brought the community together. Colonel Bantry joined her. A bad business, Jane, he said softly. 3 lives ruined, and poor Perkins dead, all for money. Not entirely, Miss Marple reflected. George Harding stole out of weakness, gambling's addictive grip. The vicar convinced himself he was serving a higher purpose. And Robert? A boy trying to help his widowed mother in all the wrong ways. And now St. Mary Mead must heal. Communities, you know, she added. They're remarkably resilient. Next year's festival will go ahead. With tighter financial controls, I imagine. The church will get its new roof through proper fundraising. And perhaps we'll all remember that the greatest crimes often spring from the smallest compromises with our conscience. The sun was setting over St. Mary Mead, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang for evensong. Life in the village would go on, as it always had, carrying its secrets and its scandals, its tragedies, and its triumphs. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. Tomorrow there would be talk, of course, gossip and speculation and moral judgments. But tonight, there was peace in knowing that truth, however painful, had finally been brought to light. "Tea?" she offered. "Colonel Bantry," he replied. With a wry smile, "I think perhaps something stronger is called for." And in the gentle ritual of shared refreshment, the healing of St. Mary Mead quietly began.